Hey everybody, I am Kevin Iole. Welcome. I appreciate you. And my guest today is obviously a very familiar face, a longtime boxing writer at both ESPN.com and USA Today, now contributing to Boxing Scene, and has a little bit of big news today. My longtime friend Dan Rafael. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing, my man?
This is the first time I think you and I have done this, and I
It
think
is.
I might surprise some people who always have thought we were enemies. But even though you do drink the Sprite,
I'm going to give you the camel clutch right now.
our buddy the Iron Sheik is going to be tuning in. We know that. So
What's up, Sheiky baby?
Hey, Sheiky. So Dan, the news, I got a news release this morning that you were in. I'm not used to getting, I'm used to getting news that you're breaking and writing about. I'm not used to getting press releases about you. But so you were going to be hosting a boxing show that begins next month on Impact Network. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, if you follow boxing closely, the Impact Network was sort of a new player in professional boxing. They weren't necessarily doing events on the caliber of the big top-ranked shows or PBC, or the DAZN shows. But what they had tried to do is find a niche for themselves of doing maybe that Friday Night Fights level card. And so they started off in February with a show that was headlined by Austin Trout in New Mexico, his home state, and put that show on just to sort of get things rolling. And they had made an announcement, probably about a month ago or so, or maybe even a longer ago, that they were going to do basically monthly cards through the rest of the year. Obviously, unfortunately, they've had to postpone at least the next several of them because of what's wrong with the pandemic. But they still want to have some boxing-related programming with the anticipation that those events will take place at some point when people get back to sports events. And so what they've done is created a show called Stars and Champions. They've asked me to be the host of that program, and we're going to do interviews with boxing personalities and fighters during this period of time where people are at home and not doing anything. And maybe we'll extend beyond this, but for the time being, I'm very much looking forward to it. Like you said, the first show will air on Impact on May 8th. And my first guest for the first show will be our good pal and somebody that we've both known for many years, is Leonard Ellerbe, the CEO of Mayweather Promotions.
That'll be a good one. Yeah, so there you have it. It's available, Impact Network. Just tell people where it's available. Is it on all the major cable and satellite networks?
It's when they talk about their availability, they're in about 80 million homes. It's not on every cable system. I don't unfortunately get it where I live here in Northern Virginia, but it is on some cable systems. They do have access to some of their programming on their website. It's also on, I believe it's on Fios and some of the satellite services and that sort of thing. So hopefully a lot of people will be able to see it, and we will have fun talking boxing with a lot of the people involved in the sport, while we're all not at fights, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that has come of this, and I hope it continues once the sport comes back, is a lot of this stuff that you and I are doing right now and that your show you're going to be doing. I think that people are getting a chance to know the fighters a little bit. Everybody's out there looking for content, so they're interviewing all the fighters and the trainers and whatnot. And to me, that's a benefit because I think, when you feel like you know somebody, you're more apt to watch and you have a rooting interest in the event. And to me, that's a good thing. And I hope it continues going on. What's your thought on that?
I agree with you about that. I think that if there is a silver lining to this lack of activity in the sport, that is one of them. Like you said, lots of people are talking to fighters. I know fighters have been, very readily available to talk, because they're kind of frankly just as bored as a lot of other people who are, not having the opportunity to go about their daily lives. I feel for them from the standpoint that they don't know when their next fight is, and they still have a desire or a need to train. They can't really train properly at the moment. Maybe they can keep in some semblance of condition, running around their block, or maybe they have a gym in their home or something. But it's not the same as by going to the regular boxing gym with your trainer, with the other guys, with your team, with the sparring partners. So they're telling their stories. Now, I think that many of us in the boxing press, do a very good job on a regular basis when fights are coming up, and we're writing about those particular bouts that are forthcoming to talk to the boxers and their teams and the different people involved with them and get their sides, get their stories and publish them and put them out there so people get to know it. But this is an opportunity with literally no fights coming up that, you just could pick anybody and they've all got something interesting going on.
Everybody's got something to say. I saw a thing on Twitter today, Dan, that maybe we got to try this in boxing. So we'll get, some of the other major boxing media, us too, and maybe we'll get Chris Mannix and Mike Coppinger, Lance Pugmire, Jake Donovan. We'll get a bunch of these guys. And Katie Nolan did a thing today I saw. I don't know if you happened to catch that on Twitter. So what she did is she had a bunch of her journalistic buddies on there, and they said, let's have a game who can get the most famous person to join this Zoom chat, right? And so they went on there. So Lin-Manuel Miranda came on, and Dwayne Wade, and they had a Clayton Kershaw. He came in and was like, what the hell is going on? So we would have to see who would be the most famous person. I would be gunning for Floyd to get Floyd on there. But
well, I know one thing is for sure: you're not winning the competition right now by having me on.
No, right now I'm kind of struggling there, but we might have to have that go on. We'll see who can pull that off, and we'll pop people in and out of there. That might be something we got.
I might have to talk to Leonard when we tape that first show for Impact.
Yeah, so we may have to do it before then, so that A, it gives you something to do, and then B, also we don't have you cheating there. Anyways, I think that's a good thing. Let's talk about this, Dan. What do you think is going to happen coming out of the break once we get back? Because I see it going both ways. On the one hand, I think that if things come back in the fall, like it looks like it's going to happen, there's going to be a ton of competition. The golf season, all the majors got pushed back. Baseball is going to be in the middle of the season at that point. You're going to have so much going on at that point that there's going to be a lot of competition. So you would think on the one hand, that is going to force everybody to put their best stuff on. But by the same token, do you want to put like even a low, what I don't consider a high level fight, Kubrat Pulev and Joshua, that would be something that would draw 60, 70,000 people over in the UK. Do they want to put that on without fans? So there's a balancing act. What do you think is going to happen?
I don't think a fight like a Joshua Pulev can happen without fans, unless, and this is a big if the boxers who are making big paydays, especially a Pulev who's due to make the biggest payday of his life in this kind of fight as a mandatory challenger, unless they're willing to take pay reductions, because the promoters who pay for the events, obviously with the revenue that comes from the pay-per-view that would take place in the UK or a big license fee from a DAZN in the United States, a fight like that in that stadium that holds about 60 to 70,000 people in London, would do a sellout crowd most likely, given Joshua's popularity. And you and I both know that would probably generate a gate of probably around $10 million thereabouts. That is not an insignificant amount of money to just automatically just wipe clean from your bottom line of revenue. Now, in some smaller fights, I'll give you an example. When Top Rank had to cancel the Shakur Stevenson fight and the Michael Conlan fight, which were the first two boxing events that were called off when this all began back in mid-March.
Jose Ramirez.
No, right, but the Shakur fight and the Michael Conlan fight were the first ones that weekend.
No. February 2nd was Jose Ramirez.
I mean, in the
you mean U.S.-based ones? Okay.
When it came here, yeah. No, you're right about that. But here's the point, though. So a fight like that does not have a huge gate. It's money. It's a few $100,000. And I talked to Bob Arum about that, and when he was thinking about going forward with those cards without fans. This is a day before they actually canceled the whole show. I said, Bob, what are you talking about in revenue for the gate for fights like that? His estimation was that the Shakur Stevenson Miguel Mariaga card was selling pretty well, and that their gate would probably be somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. The Conlan fight that was going to be on the Tuesday, a little bit less, in that 250-ish range. But he was willing to forego that because in the scheme of their dollars from ESPN and some other revenue they had, it wasn't that big of a deal, all things considered, and they would take the hit. Promoters were willing to do that. You can't take that kind of hit on a Joshua fight, on a Canelo Alvarez fight, right, on a fight that's going to generate, a good seven-figure gate, even a fight that's lesser than a Canelo or a Joshua fight. So I don't think that we're going to see those big matches when they come back, but there's no reason we can't see the kinds of fights that ordinarily would have generated, a low six-figure gate where they can put those events on. There'll be probably less expenses involved with the event overall because there'll be less people there. They'll probably put a few less fights on the show. They may not be able to do championship fights, so that would lessen the financial commitment even a little bit more. Everybody would be in one location for a short period of time. So I think it's possible to do those kinds of fights. Doing a much bigger fight, that's a hard one, Kevin. I just don't see it because even if we can get those fights back, some activity in the middle to the late summer, I don't see there being an event where we're going to have, 20,000 people, at an arena or 15,000 at the MGM Grand or something along those lines. It's just, you got to wait and see what the medical and the professionals say, but I'm not confident in that.
I thought Nevada was going to start to open, middle of next month. But I saw today they joined a consortium of California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, all the states working together, and they're not going to open. They're all going to come together at the same time, right? So given that is the situation, that tells me that
lose you?
There's not – you still there, Dan? Dan? Dan, can you hear me? Dan? Hello, Dan.
Yeah, are you there? I got
There
you.
we are. Okay, so we had a
What's up on
little
it?
technical glitch. But I guess what I was saying is, Nevada joined this consortium of other states, and they're going to work together to open up. Well, California has been really aggressive by saying we're going to take a long time. The mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, said there may not be live sports until next spring in California. So if that makes Nevada doing the same thing, you have two of the biggest states that host fights that aren't going to have anything going for a long time. So I agree. We're looking at something where some of these big fights may not happen.
Look, I also think that some of the fights, when they do come back, may be in other locations of states that are willing to open up because maybe they have, fewer cases of coronavirus, or maybe they just have governors that are a little braver than the officials in other states. So maybe a Texas, maybe a Florida.
Everything's going to Georgia.
To do that, Georgia. But again, the promoters that I've heard from, you read the comments, they're like Bob Arum. I saw some comments from him. He's willing to do this. He wants to do it. They're actively working with commissions and trying to brainstorm ideas of how to do it. But everything that Bob keeps coming back to is, yes, we want to do this, but as long as we're sure that it's going to be safe for all the people involved, his staff, himself, the fighters, their teams. I mean, that's paramount, is the safety of everybody.
Last thing on this, but there was, I know the UFC had put a long, in-depth proposal into Governor Sisolak here in Nevada about having events at its apex, and they were willing to have boxing matches in there as well. So, maybe do 3 UFC events a week and then have 2 or 3 boxing matches and have that thing running every day. But right now, the governor said it wasn't ready in Nevada, even though our crazy mayor, is trying to
Crazy indeed, my man.
That was nuts. But that would have been a great thing, because now you would have been able to run in the same place. And even though there would have still been risks, I think everything is more contained, and you eliminate some of the problems that you would have had, going into regular arenas.
They also have to make sure when they do this, if they're able to do this, is that the quick and accurate testing has to be part of it. Because you bring people into the bubble and they're going to be there for, let's say 3 or 4 days from beginning to end of the, when you get there, to the weigh-in, to the medical exams, to the rules meeting, to the event itself. You need to everybody in the bubble. So they have to make sure all the people are clean when they get in, and that they somehow keep them all together in that bubble over the course of the period of time for those few days before they can leave. You can't do
once you leave, you can't get back in.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have somebody like go and be clean and go to the weigh-in and then leave to go out to do whatever, come back the next day, and maybe they had interactions, in those 18 hours between the weigh-in and when they come to the arena, and cause people to get ill. It's very complicated. It sounds doable, but there's so many things that have to happen to get it the right way. Not to mention, by the way, Kevin, even if they want to bring this in to have these guys do these closed door fights at some point, before you can actually do that, you have to notify everybody involved and get the matches made and give those guys, I'm not saying they're going to have
back into train.
They got to have a few weeks in the gym with the trainer, with the sparring, and that's complicated also.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of problems of getting this thing going. That's why I think it's going to be later rather than sooner. Let's get into talking a little bit about the fights. And, one of the things I've written a lot in the last 6 to 9 months is I said, in a lot of ways, I think we're in a golden age of boxing. I think there's a lot of really good fighters now. And I submit to you the 135-pound division with all those great young talents that we have there. You have the great champion in Lomachenko, you have Teofimo Lopez, Tank Davis, but then Devin Haney and Ryan Garcia, and there's so many good fighters. And I think throughout boxing, that's there now. But boxing isn't where it was in the 1980s when, Sugar Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler were household names. Do you think we can ever get it? Is there any way that we can ever get it to that point, or get it closer to that point than it is right now, where it's more, as much as we love it, it's more of a niche sport?
Well, I think it's going to be a niche sport, for the long term. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because it still has a lot of fans. It can still generate a lot of money and bring a lot of excitement. And even a niche sport on its biggest night can be the biggest sport in the world. So when there's the match that people want to see, it overtakes everything else in the sports world, like say a Mayweather Pacquiao, or we may say more recently, we saw firsthand the amount of promotion and excitement and mainstream attention that was lavished on the fight between Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury when they met in the rematch just in February, which just seems like a lifetime ago, even though it was a couple of months ago. So I think that a Tyson Fury and a Deontay Wilder, for example, I don't know if I'd say they're household names, but they're known by a lot of people that wouldn't ordinarily know a boxer even at the top of the sport. So that's a good thing. But I don't think we're going to ever see it back at that level again. But I think like you said, I think it's in a pretty good spot. There's lots of good fighters. There's a lot of good matches that are being made, even if we're not getting every single match we do want to see. There is a quality presence on basic cable with the ESPN fights. There's a quality presence on the network, free TV with the Fox fights that they put on with the PBC. And you have obviously some of the many of the big names also for those who want to buy a streaming service, whether it's the Zone or the additional bounce that Top Rank puts on ESPN Plus. So there's a lot of quality outlets with a lot of quality matches. I think that, you know, to be honest, if you take a look around, I mean, look, you and I know each other a long time, and we've quibbled about fights with each other privately many times about some of the bad ones that some promoters will put on. But even with some ones that are consistently, they have been weak, they also have put on lots of big, excellent matches. I will definitely credit to all the outlets, you know, at least the United States outlets that we deal with, whether it's Golden Boy or Eddie Hearn on their DAZN events, or Top Rank with their ESPN events, and certainly PBC with their Showtime and Fox FS1 events. There are a lot of good fights that they put on. I just know that there's more that can be made, and I'm hopeful that they'll get together and continue to try to make those bigger fights. I thought it was a huge breakthrough that they were able to, without a lot of agita, frankly, putting on the Wilder Fury rematch. I mean, Kevin, you know, the absolute nature of covering Mayweather Pacquiao. It was terrible. It was awful. It was the complete opposite when those organizations got together to do Wilder Fury. And I'm hopeful that pleasant experience, by all accounts, from both sides, would say, you know what, we can do this, and they can make other fights between the companies, whether it's Crawford or, you know, pick some other fight.
I think there's evidence that tells me that boxing is on the upswing. And even though I was disappointed in the pay-per-view number that Wilder Fury did, because I thought ESPN and PBC and Fox and Top Rank did fantastic in terms of the promoting of that fight, and Wilder and Fury did as well. It couldn't have been any better. I was pumping gas one day, Dan. You may have seen it on Twitter, and they had a little one of those screens, and there was an ad for the fight on there. I mean, so it was crazy. It was everywhere. But the thing that
I have to say one thing though. One thing though is that, and I don't have like exact evidence, but I am convinced for a variety of reasons that the number was quote unquote disappointing just because of the sheer magnitude of the piracy.
Well, yeah, and I wrote about the piracy right after it happened. But here's what heartens me. Think about this. 2 weeks ago, ESPN put on that block on a Saturday, 11 hours of fights, you know, they had the 3 Ali Frazier fights. And, you know, of course, it's Muhammad Ali and it's Joe Frazier, 2 of the most iconic fighters ever. But that peaked at 835,000 viewers. That's more than most live fights get.
They were doubling essentially like a mid-level Showtime card. They were doubling a mid-level live ESPN card.
What that says to me, Dan, is that people are interested in the product, but you have to, you know, there's a long way to go to get them to come back and watch.
Look, it was so successful, the block that you mentioned, that ESPN did something similar this past week. Now, it wasn't the Frazier fights, but they showed a handful of fights. I think one was Mayweather.
Judah Mayweather, Pacquiao Cotto, Pacquiao Marquez 3, and Mayweather Pat.
Exactly. So they showed some more modern fights. I think that they can continue to do that and draw upon the vast and outstanding Top Rank library, certainly the big fights library that ESPN owns, that they can continue to do that. Because look, I'm down with seeing Muhammad Ali fights, but I've seen those fights a gazillion times.
Right.
So I get that they're trying to reach the masses, and it's cool that they put those on. So you can do that once in a while. But you know what? They have such a massive library. Go back and pick a classic that maybe hasn't been seen the most. You still may draw some interest and do it that way. They have thousands and thousands of fights to draw from. They don't have to keep showing the same 8 fights over and over again.
I tweeted last week, and you'll laugh at this. You know, I wrote a story, and I talked about, you know, how successful they were on TV, and I said one of the fights I wanted to see was Johnny LaCicero against Caveman Lee, and that was like a 1980, what was it, 82 fight, 1981.
It was one of the first fights on the old Top Rank Boxing.
Right.
ESPN had first started, and you know, neither of those guys are household names or big stars, but it was one of the most, you know, crazy, epic, you know, slugfest.
Like Foreman-Lyle type fight, right? You know, everybody, most boxing fans know the Foreman-Lyle fight, and that was crazy. And you take that and you bring it down to the smaller weight, non-well-known guys, and that's the kind of thing that's just a major crazy brawl.
I don't think it's out of the realm to say that maybe in the entire history of ESPN's existence, from the Top Rank series back in the 80s through, you know, some of the PBC fights, through the current Top Rank series, and any other fights they may have done in between, that particular fight might be the greatest, you know, action fight they ever showed in the network history. I mean, and that's including fights like Mickey Ward, Emmanuel Augustus.
Yeah.
Julian Letterlow against Julio Gonzalez, and some of the other good exciting fights that have been on the Top Rank series. But that Caveman Lee Cicero fight, to think that basically two club fighters from 35 years ago, people still talk about today, is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, just an amazing fight, and it was called, of course, by Sal Marciano and Al Bernstein. So
yeah, good friend Al, exactly.
Yeah, that was something else.
Al does sometimes before the big fights in Vegas. He'd have these like little parties and so I went to one of those once years ago, and he asks trivia, and he puts on a great show,
and he sings
a little bit, and he shows some video clips, and they do trivia. I remember the first one of those I ever went to, they showed a lot of clips of that particular fight, and people were going crazy who had never seen it before.
Yeah, just so much fun. The first fight you and I covered together, obviously, I know you know this, was 2000, De La Hoya Mosley won. But here's what I don't know if you remember from that fight. There was an undercard fight in the ring, and we were sitting side by side, as we ultimately did for many years at fights after that. But we're sitting side by side, and all of a sudden you hear the crowd going crazy. And I turn around and I see the upper deck at the Staples Center looking down, and I'm thinking there's a fight in the lower bowl. And
special guest for a quick second.
Hey, what's up, buddy?
My buddy Kevin. Say hello.
Hi.
Okay.
Hey there.
Let me finish doing this.
And so we had the
photo bomb.
You got to bring him in. We love it. And so you saw everybody looking down, and I'm thinking, oh, there's a fight in the lower bowl. And all of a sudden, I see the fighters in the ring, Diego Corrales and Justin Juco, looking over, and they're fighting, and they stop. And all of a sudden, the crowd picks up, Ali. Yes. And Ali walked in. And so that was 2000. Now,
that was June 2000.
Right.
You know why he was there, right?
I don't remember what the reason was.
In Los Angeles, because just a couple of nights before that fight, Layla Ali, his daughter, had her first professional bout in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Hometown. So he had come to that fight. Many of us covered that fight.
Yeah.
And the big fight on Saturday between Shane and Oscar.
Well, what I thought was interesting, was that here it's 20 years after he, his last fight. It's, that was 30 years after his big fight, and he still had that kind of respect, and that showed to me. I mean, the entire place, the fighter. I remember Corrales in the corner, and he was clapping as Ali walked to his seat, and
right.
Just it was a remarkable scene. And I look at it and I say, can boxing ever get to that where fighters today are as revered as Ali? And maybe not. But I certainly think that they can get up and climb up the list a lot better than they are right now.
It's going to be hard to match an Ali on that level of that kind of respect.
Right.
I say every arena that I ever went to over the years. Okay, that's enough.
What's his name, by the way? You want to tell everybody, say hello.
His name is Jesse.
Jesse Rafael.
He every time I was ever in an arena where Ali attended a fight, that same scene played out. Seen it happen in Las Vegas, right. Seen it happen in New York at the Madison Square Garden, obviously what you mentioned in Los Angeles. But if there's one that can be even remotely compared to that, when Tyson comes to a fight, and he goes to a lot of matches, as you know, he gets that kind of treatment.
Not nearly that big, but he gets a good one.
Yeah. No, but of course, his fights are all at this point, is a number of years ago already. As far as the current stars, or your recently retired stars, I'm not sure. I mean, there's, Sugar Ray Leonard gets ovations when he goes to fights, and he's had a lot of fights also. Of today's group of guys, it's hard to say. I mean, will Tyson Fury get that kind of reception at future events, or Deontay Wilder, or Vasyl Lomachenko, or an Errol Spence, or a Terrence Crawford, or some of the, the pound for pound current greats of today? It's interesting. I mean, I never thought about it, but we'll have to see, I suppose.
I tell you a funny story that, when you mentioned Layla, she's probably not going to like this story, but I was covering one of her open workouts. Her ex-husband, Johnny McClain, was training her, and they were getting in the ring, and she was just going to start hitting the mitts, and it was at a gym and no longer open on East Sahara in Las Vegas. And so there was it was the Las Vegas media. There wasn't national media there, but it was a good turnout and a lot of photographers and everything. So I'm standing there, and the door, like say, was on the east side, and then there was another door on the south side. And Layla's getting up, and she's about to hit the mitts, and all of a sudden the door on the south side opens, and people look over, and in walks her dad, right? And all the photographers run off the ring, and they run over, and they go to see Muhammad, and they're taking, and she's standing in the ring. So I was actually on the apron watching. So I just stand there, and she's like, God damn him. And, she's cursing. And I said, hey, that's Muhammad Ali you're talking about. And she yelled at me. She goes, that's my dad. He's an asshole. She was very upset about that day. I thought it was hilarious.
I'll say, I mean, I didn't say this when I first was talking about it, but, of modern fighters that could achieve that kind of reception wherever they would walk in. certainly when, 20, 25 years from now, if Floyd Mayweather goes to a boxing event or Manny Pacquiao goes to, they'll get the same kind of reception because they're worldwide figures. They both have, big fan bases, and they're known even by people who aren't boxing fans that are, not even sports fans. Everybody now at this point pretty much knows who Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather are, all around the world.
When Floyd and Manny fought, it was a disappointing fight, and Manny, had the bad shoulder and everything, but a lot of people diminish Floyd's win, and they say it wasn't that great of a fight, and it was a shot Manny Pacquiao. And while I agree it wasn't the most exciting fight in the world, look what Manny Pacquiao's done since, and he beat Keith Thurman, he beat Adrian Broner. So I'm not so sure it was a shot Manny Pacquiao. I just think you saw how good Floyd Mayweather was.
Well, that's true. We all know Floyd's a great fighter. And whether you think it was a shot Manny Pacquiao or not, I'm not making it as not an excuse, but if you believe the reality, Manny may have had the injured shoulder, which underwent surgery after the fight. Certainly that may have impacted his performance. He wasn't about to call off, the $600 million fight. But again, Floyd gets credit for the win. That was, as we all know, that was the fight to prove this era's greatest fighter. And Mayweather not only won, but he won very convincingly. Whether it was aesthetically pleasing or not the issue. He won the fight, hands down. You can't have a conversation not regard Mayweather as the number one fighter of this period of time, the last 20 years, let's say.
Did you pick Mayweather as the fighter of the decade?
Well, when we did the thing at ESPN, we didn't actually pick an official fighter of the decade. The idea was the faces of the decade, and so we picked three. One was Mayweather, one was Pacquiao, and one was Canelo. I thought that the decision really came down, if you were going to have an authentic pick, came down to either Mayweather or Canelo. And yes, you can make a great argument for Mayweather. He's certainly, undefeated and had a lot of huge fights. But the problem, if you're against that pick, is that other than the McGregor fight, which was in 2017 and a layup kind of fight, he only fought half the decade. He only fought 5 years of the decade. It's fighter of the decade, not fighter of the 5 years. So some people wanted to say Mayweather. Obviously, he had made the most money.
That's who I picked.
And that's a fair point. And others went with Canelo, whose entirety of his championship run, from his first world title and his introduction in America through his most recent fight, at the end of the decade, all took place in that 10-year period of time. So, I can see arguments on both sides. If you choose Canelo, it's not a diminishment of Mayweather's accomplishments. It's just he didn't do as much in the decade, even though, of course, one of those victories came against Canelo. So,
well, I think that Dan, I want to say this, though, because I want to get a name in there that you haven't mentioned. You mentioned Pacquiao, Mayweather, Canelo, and those are the big three. But I thought Andre Ward was the runner-up in this thing. Andre Ward was undefeated. He won the Super 6 title, had a huge number, of big wins in that period of time. And I thought Andre Ward deserved to be in that conversation as well.
I can see that being part of the conversation. But again, for my purposes, in my opinion, again, nothing against Andre. He's a great fighter. He'll be on the first, ballot for the Hall of Fame next year and certainly get my vote. No question about it. I just don't think he had enough big victories and big events to put him number one or number two. I would still put him in the decade behind Canelo and Pacquiao, even though he had wins that you can't argue with. He also won a gold medal, for what that's worth, in the Olympic Games. But he didn't have that level of events. It really, he blew away the competition in the tournament, where he beat Mikkel Kessler and Arthur Abraham, and obviously Carl Froch, a likely Hall of Famer himself, in the final.
Tremendous fighter.
Had the two wins against Kovalev, although you can argue the first fight probably should have gone Kovalev's way. A lot of people believe that. I thought that Kovalev should have won that first fight. Certainly made up for it in the rematch by stopping him in the second fight. So those are the candidates. It's just a matter of which order you put them in. For me, again, all respect to Andre, he's a great guy and was a great fighter. But I would put him a little bit behind the Mayweather, Pacquiao, and Canelo trio.
I think when you look at those four, this is my way of breaking it down. I say there's no question that Pacquiao fought the best competition, right? From the beginning of his career to the end, but certainly in the decade, Pacquiao fought the best fighters. I don't think there's any question about that. Canelo probably would rank second in that list, but then, he had a draw, and he also, lost, and the draw, some people thought, he lost the fight. He got whipped big by Floyd. Andre probably, had, how do we compare Andre and Floyd's level of competition? I thought Andre fought a lot of good guys, not the big name guys. And he not only won them, he won 11 rounds to 1, or he won by knockout.
He also didn't have as many fights, though. You know what I mean? He had
Correct.
had some injuries and he had some promotional entanglements that caused him to be on the shelf for a little while. So he didn't have that robust of a schedule. But when you're at the absolute top of the sport, you're picking hairs. It's sort of like, the guy that wins the 100 meters in the Olympics, in 9 seconds and something, the man that finishes second is like 100th of a second behind him. That's the level of players that we're doing here.
I think and I think Pacquiao, Mayweather, and Canelo, history is going to judge them well. But I think Andre Ward's going to be judged better by history than he was in his own time. Andre wasn't a guy out there in the media a lot. He's out there a lot more now than he was, when he was.
Because he works in the media.
Right. And I by the way, I think he's the best broadcaster there is. I love Andre, broadcaster. But I think, the fact that, he was kind of out of the media and out of the spotlight a lot. You didn't see him around fights unless he was actually fighting. I think when history looks at him, 20, 40, 50 years from now, he's going to be regarded more highly than he is today in his own era.
I think it's similar the way you're speaking about. I agree with what you're saying. I think it's a similar case of what happened with Lennox Lewis, who was very similar when he was fighting. He didn't like to do a lot of interviews, certainly when he was not in the ring. He was kind of standoffish and aloof to the press when he was fighting, and post his career, loosened up, become much more friendly. I actually said to him one time years ago when he was working for HBO, I had seen him at a fight that we were covering. I was at Caesar's Palace, and we were having a conversation. And I was considered a Lennox guy in the American press. And the thing is, I said, he was telling a joke or something. He was such a relaxed guy. I said, Lennox, if you had been a little bit more like this when you were fighting, you would have such a much bigger name and fan base in America. And he said, you're probably right. I'm paraphrasing, but when you're a champ, you have to have that wall around you. And I couldn't do that. So I had to do what was best for me to make sure that I protected myself and continued to, be focused and win my fights. And I can understand that point of view, but history has judged Lennox much more kindly than he was ever judged when he was an active fighter. And I think the same will be the case for somebody like Vladimir Klitschko, many years after his retirement. I mean, those three guys had similar qualities, as you mentioned, Ward, Klitschko, and Lennox, and history is going to be really kind to them in my mind.
I believe that. I'll let you get rolling here in a couple seconds. One thing I want, everybody asked me this, and I'm sure they ask you too. What is the greatest fight you ever covered, and in person? It has to be in person. And then secondly, if you say there's only one fight I can ever watch again, what fight would that be? So it can be a fight, any fight that you saw before you were covering boxing, if there anything subsequent to it, but those two things.
Well, the greatest fight that I ever covered in person is not even, to me, it's really not it's easy. I mean, some people might say, well, there's a few different ones and they can start naming off a bunch of them. Now, we've been very fortunate that over our careers, I've done this now for 20 years. I've covered, many, many great fights, some all-time fights. And with a lot of the greatest fighters of that time, I've covered everybody, just like you have, whether it's Mayweather, Pacquiao, Mike Tyson, the Klitschko's, Bernard Hopkins, Felix Trinidad, De La Hoya, Mosley. I mean, I'm sure I'm forgetting guys, but the greatest fight that I ever covered, hands down, May 7th, 2005, the Mandalay Bay Event Center, the lightweight title unification between Jose Luis Castillo and Diego Chico Kraus, which Showtime just replayed a couple of weeks ago. And people got to see that just coincidentally. Myself and our pals Tim Smith and Dougie Fisher were the Showtime ringside scorers for that historical fight. And it was absolutely sensational. I can still remember where I was sitting, what I was wearing, my feeling after the fight. It's the first time I ever saw, and it doesn't happen often. Now, it wasn't a matter of like cheering in the press box, which you're not supposed to do, but out of respect for the fighters, basically every single guy there at ringside in the media section,
jaws were dropped.
Applauded those two guys, what they gave in that fight. And I've told this story before. When that fight was over, I was working for USA Today at that time. And I had a sort of like, maybe I was with you. I think it was one of my first fights for ESPN actually, but I was so overcome with the emotion of that fight that, and you're just like so invested in just sweating and just a mess. The fights end, Kevin, how many deadline stories have we written? It just kicks in, you just start writing. I actually had to take a minute, take a deep breath and kind of push myself away from the table and just collect myself for 1 or 2 minutes. Before
incredible.
Because I was sort of like shaking. It was that kind of emotional fight. And all you're thinking is like, oh my God, how am I going to write the first draft of history of maybe the greatest fight in the history of boxing? So to me, that is still the standard of the best fight I have ever covered. As far as what the other one, the best fight I've ever seen, that even if I wasn't at the fight, or if I would only watch one more fight, it might be that one. I also might take, a Hagler Hearns, although it didn't last that long. Everybody who's followed me knows I'm a massive Arturo Gatti fan. I might go with, Gatti Ward 1 or Gatti Ward 3, or Gatti versus Wilson Rodriguez, which I actually recently just rewatched because the anniversary just passed. But those are some of the fights that come to my mind.
Let me tell you Gatti Ward 1 story. You'll love this one. So that fight was obviously on the East Coast.
Well, what was your answer? What is your answer to those questions? I want to know.
Corrales Castillo was the best fight I ever covered. I wrote that, and that was the best fight I ever covered. The fight that I would take as my fight that I would want to see would be Ali Frazier 3. Because I just thought the punishment they gave, and you're at a high skill level under, as I said, subhuman conditions. I mean, over 100 degrees, and it was nuts. And Hagler Hearns was great, and Gatti Ward was great. But to me, Ali Frazier 3 is the standard by which I judge all the other fights for what they went through. But the night you were at the Gatti Ward 1 fight, I was here.
I wasn't. I was not at Gatti Ward 1.
Oh, you weren't at that fight?
I was supposed to go to Gatti Ward 1, and I got sick with the flu or some, virus, well, not the coronavirus. I had a temperature, and like the day before I was supposed to travel to Connecticut, I had to cancel my trip. I did cover in person Gatti Ward 2 and Gatti Ward 3, but I watched Gatti Ward 1 in my old townhouse on a bed in the guest room with a wet cloth on my head, just sick as a dog.
Well, this is the worst thing that happened to me then, because that night I'm at Mandalay Bay Event Center for Ben Tacky against Kostya Tszyu, and it was one of the worst fights ever. And afterwards, Dougie Fisher and Steve Kim and myself were walking to go to Raffles at Mandalay Bay to get something to eat, and Larry Merchant calls Steve, and he's talking about the fight, and you could hear Larry's voice, and he said it was the privilege of a lifetime or something like that to be at ringside. And I'm going, oh my God, we're talking. And so when we get to the restaurant that we go to, what are we talking about? We're not talking about the Tacky and Kostya Tszyu fight. We're talking about Gatti and Ward, and what a bad.
And by the way, that was long enough ago where you couldn't just pop on Twitter and see highlights because it didn't exist.
Exactly.
Even YouTube was still not, ubiquitous where you could easily find somebody that had posted the fight. So you probably had to wait, at least several hours or till the next day to maybe catch a replay of it.
So I got home. Well, I recorded the fight, so I did. Okay. I went home and I saw that night. But yeah, that was
probably on a VCR, not on a DVR back then, right?
I was up late that night. I remember that. Yeah, that was crazy. So, and last thing. So here's the last thing. One fighter. Who's the fighter? If you could watch one fighter and that's it, who is that?
Well, everybody knows my all-time favorite fighter is Arturo Gatti. I've said that, to people over the years. I was an Arturo Gatti fan before I started to cover boxing. I was always a boxing fan, but the fight that I saw in the mid-'90s when he fought against Wilson Rodriguez, that I believe was the main event of the second ever Boxing After Dark on HBO. So that was 1996. Again, I'm a fan of watching fights, but that one truly rekindled it in a sense that it made me seek out even fights that weren't the big, huge fights and watch them. And so that fight was a big deal for me. And I started to, become much, much more involved on the very, daily basis of following the sport, more than I had been before. But so that was just one of so many of the great Gatti fights. He had so many after that. Even people forget that even he had a whole slew of great fights before he even had the trilogy with Mickey Ward.
Oh, of course.
Some other, good fights post Mickey Ward. But I guess I'd have to go with Gatti. I mean, people know I'm a big collector of posters and that sort of stuff. Well, in my office, I have one thing hanging up. I don't have the other posters hanging up. I have this big charcoal portrait of Gatti hanging up in my office. So I would definitely, if I had to just take one guy, I would take my Arturo Gatti career collection of fights and watch those. I mean, there's at least 10 fights that are all-time great fights in his career.
You mentioned that Gatti Wilson Rodriguez fight. We got to give a shout out to our buddy Lou DiBella, because that was the second Boxing After Dark fight. The first one the week before was sensational. Kennedy McKinney and Marco Antonio Barrera. And then you pop back and you've got Gatti and Wilson Rodriguez. Like, you talk about starting a series off the right way. I mean, that was just wow. It can't get any better than that. I'll end it with this, Dan. Of course, Muhammad Ali. I grew up as an Ali fan. I actually, I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I was a kid, my dad took me to a fight. My dad fought in the Army, and he was a boxing fan. And he always told my mother it was a gift for me, but I was like 5 or 6 years old. He took me to Sugar Ray Robinson fight. And I saw, it turned out at the time we didn't know
Sugar Ray Robinson?
it was his last fight.
Oh, okay.
1965, he fought in Pittsburgh, Joey Archer, and it was Robinson's last fight. And my dad, we didn't know it was his last fight. Right. I can't even remember the details, but my dad subsequently said. But I went to the fight with my dad that night and saw Sugar Ray Robinson. So I saw Sugar Ray Robinson, who in my opinion is the greatest fighter of all time. But if I'm ever going to pick a fighter, it's got to be Ali, and how iconic he was. And I've told this story a few times, but I'll share it with you one more time. I never got to cover his career. I covered boxing. I covered Larry Holmes. Ronaldo Snipes was my first major fight that I covered, and that was 1981. But I never got a chance to cover Ali. So this was like in the late 80s, early 90s. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I'm going into a meeting at the Clark County Government Building here in Las Vegas, and it was an athletic commission meeting. And Gene Kilroy's right at the front. Gene Kilroy was one of the guys that worked for Ali. And he's like, "Kevin, come here." And Gene, and so Gene's pretty insistent. You just can't get away from Gene when he wants you. If
Gene says come here, you go there.
You go, and it's like the meeting is about to start. I got to get inside, get my seat. I'm like, Gene, I got to get. He goes, "Come here." So I walk over, and Gene says, "I want to introduce you to somebody." And so I'm saying to myself, "Oh my God." We walk around the corner, and there is Ali and his wife, and I went. And I saw him, and it was just like, I said this before, it was like seeing God. I saw him, and my heart stopped, and I didn't know what to say. And so that was a day, he talked most of the time at that point, but there were some days when he didn't. So he went like this to me, and he grabbed my head, and he pulled, pulled my ear down to his mouth. And he said, "You must be the greatest, because what my friend tells me about you." And I could not wait to call my father and say, "You're never going to believe what Muhammad Ali just said to me." That was, I always remember that. It was just such a
Even if you're not a starstruck person, that's still a starstruck kind of moment. I only got a chance to meet Ali one time in Los Angeles around the time that his daughter's fight took place that night at the amphitheater in LA, but that's a great story.
And then lastly, his 70th birthday, Dina DeBuff invited me to his birthday party that raised money for the Lou Ruvo Center here in Las Vegas. And I was sitting way in the back of the room. And when he came out, he wasn't there. That was the night you remember that Bob Arum yelled out, "I love the UFC," because they were trying to get Lorenzo Fertitta to bid on a glove, which he ultimately paid $1.5 million for a signed Ali glove against Floyd Patterson. So that was a great moment. But I had said that night that I wanted to get, and I told Ali's wife that I'd like to get a picture with Muhammad if I could. And so I'm in the back of the room, and he's at the absolute front of the room. And the night's almost over, and all of a sudden somebody comes back and says, "Ali's up there. They want you to take a picture with them." And I wend my way through, and you get to his table. And it's one of those big round tables, tables of 10. It's on the floor of the Grand Garden. And it's like navigating. I mean, it's like the Secret Service is out there. You couldn't get in. And they're pushing me. And at this point, he's got the blank face, and he's not really moving. And I walk up, and I get behind him, and they take the picture, and I put my arm on his shoulder. And he said something, and I couldn't make out what it was that he said. And as I walk away, his wife turns around, and she says, "He said, thank you for coming to see him." And I was just like,
there you go.
That was quite something.
I've had my picture taken with a lot of fighters, but not Muhammad Ali, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately for me, the picture is like really dark, because it was, the MGM garden, and it was they had the lights on the stage, and the floor, the people were dark. So it's not, I would have it sitting right up here above me if I could, but unfortunately no. Well, Dano, I appreciate it. The future for you, I hope. What's going on? What do you have other than Impact TV coming up?
Well, I'm just relaxing a little bit, frankly, and writing some stuff for our good friend Rick Reno over at Boxing Scene, and talking to a few people about this and that. And you're not going to get rid of me that quick. I'll be around. I'll be seeing you at fights.
Well, check them out on Boxing Scene.
When we have fights, hopefully, and there's media allowed to co-cover the fights. Hopefully that'll happen later.
I look forward to seeing you, brother. Dan Rafael from Boxing Scene and Impact Television, my man.
Thanks a lot, Kevin.